Hi everybody, my name is Qingpeng Zhu. I'm happy to present our work, Integration of Vergence, Cyclovergence, and Saccades through active-efficient coding. This project is collaborated with Professor Jochen Triesch and Professor Bertram. First, I would like to give a brief introduction of the eye movements we model in this work. Saccades are quick jumps from one fixation to another. Human implement saccades about 2 or 3 times per second. Saccades are quite important to the visual system because it helps to direct gaze so that the fovea falls on the object of interest. The second is vergence, which is a disconjugate eye movement, meaning that it rotates both eyes horizontally in opposite directions. Vergence brings the images of the 2 eyes into correspondence. The third is torsional eye movements, which rotate both eyes around their line of sight. But usually it has very small amplitude and hardly to observe. However, it's quite important to the visual system because it helps to align the orientation of the images. There are 2 types of torsional eye movements, cyclovergence and cycloversion. In this work, we focus on cyclovergence, which helps to align the orientation of the left and right eye images. The motivation of this work is that first, we would like to build up a realistic development model of eye movements. The biological reason is that different types of eye movements co-develop during early infancy. And another thing is that we want to study the interactions between different types of eye movements. One interesting question is that whether the introduction of one type of eye movement influences the development of other types of eye movements. Here we list some previous models for learning eye movements related to our project. One of our previous colleagues from our lab proposed a unified framework for joint learning of visual perception and eye movement control based on active-efficient coding. He then used the active-efficient coding framework to model the learning process of vergence. To make it more realistic, we propose to jointly learn vergence and saccades. There are 2 subworks related to this topic. One is learning vergence with saliency-driven saccades. The other is learning vergence and saccades simultaneously. Both 2 works shows that the introduction of saccades improves the learning of vergence. And then we try to apply the computational model onto the real binocular platform, but we found orientation misalignment issue between the left and right images. That's why we consider to model the cyclovergence. So here we use the same framework to model the cyclovergence with perfect vergence and saccade control. So in this work, we are going to combine all these 3 eye movements into one single framework. In this work, we model the joint development of perception behavior during the interaction between the agent and the environment. The way that the agent interacts with the environment is by processing and manipulating the observations. The observations in this task are the images from the 2 eyes. From the agent side, it contains 2 parts, perception and behavior. The perception part takes the images as input, extracting features, and send the features to the behavior part. Then the behavior part will generate the actions on the eyes, and this will change the observations in the next round. To model the development of eye movements, we propose the active-efficient coding framework based on Barlow's efficient coding hypothesis, which suggests that sensory processing neurons should be adaptive to input distribution. Active-efficient coding is an extension of Barlow's hypothesis, which includes active behavior control. In our case, the observations are the binocular image pairs, and then it will send to the perception part, which is modeled by an unsupervised learning algorithm, which learn to extract binocular features. Then these features will send to the behavior part, which is modeled by a neural network whose weights are updated by a reinforcement learning algorithm. It then will generate actions for modeling the eye movements. One thing to highlight is that both perception and behavior part share the same objective function, which is to minimize the reconstruction error of the binocular images using the learned binocular feature extractors. Here we show a demo of our previous work. In this work, we use the same training environment, which is the ICAP simulator. In the video, we use the two red rays to represent the gaze direction of the robot. In the right bottom window, we show the anaglyph images of the left and right eyes. So during training, every 10 iterations, the robot will make a saccade to a new point. And then during fixation, the robot will implement vergence and cyclovergence. Here we show some results of learned control policies. This figure shows the probability of vergence actions as a function of horizontal disparity. What we observed is that in most of the cases, horizontal disparity can be cancelled within one vergence action. For cyclovergence policy, we compare the learned policy with the listings law, which is summarized from the human data. What we see is that the learned policies is consistent with the listings law, which says that the cyclovergence is a function of tilt and vergence. This figure shows how many saliency regions get attention using different saccade policy recorded at the time point during training. What we observed is that as time goes on, the saccade policies tends to pay more attention on saliency regions. We also implement some experiments to study interactions between eye movements. We first trained both vergence and cyclovergence with two types of saccades. One is random saccades denoted by the dashed curves. The other is the learning saccades case denoted by the solid curves. These curves represent the vergence or cyclovergence error as a function of training time. The conclusion is that the saccades improve the learning of both vergence and cyclovergence, which is consistent with our previous work. We then study the interaction between the vergence and cyclovergence. It turns out the vergence learning is not affected by different cyclovergence policy. We trained vergence with two different cyclovergence policies, zero cyclovergence and learning cyclovergence. The result is as shown in this figure. However, the performance of vergence influences the cyclovergence learning. In this experiment, we train cyclovergence with two types of vergence. One is with a certain vergence error. The other is with a learning vergence. So why does AEC account for the development of the eye movements? Here we provide an intuitive explanation. These figures show binocular images with different horizontal and cyclo disparities. The first row shows the anaglyph of left and right images. The second row shows the difference between the two images. And what we observe is that for the zero horizontal and zero cyclo disparity case, we get less difference between the left and right images. And the reward is the core of our model. So we also plot the reward as a function of different horizontal and cyclo disparities at different checkpoints during training. And what we observed is that the reward has a peak at zero horizontal and cyclo disparities, meaning that this kind of reward will drive the actions to cancel the disparity so that it always gets the highest reward. So to conclude this talk, in this work, we proposed a unifying framework for the joint development of early visual representations and the control of three types of eye movements: vergence, cyclovergence, and saccades. AEC provides a parsimonious framework to account for the simultaneous learning of active vision skills. Our results also demonstrate the importance of the interaction between the learning of these eye movements in terms of learning speed and accuracy. Thanks for your attention.